Hello, and welcome to the start of another series. So this is going to be, I suppose, a spin-off from the Seeds of Flourishing series. I'm going to call this Things That Spark Joy. And the plan is to do it on camera, and in each episode I'll feature something in the region of 1 to 5 things that spark joy. It might be therefore a group of things that are very similar, or it might be one item that I think is worthy of a deeper dive. And maybe in the comments section, if you're watching, say, an episode where I do 5 or 3 or whatever of something, and you want me to go into a bit more detail about one of the things that you see on camera, then that could be potentially another episode. So something to think about. So in this first episode, it's going to be, I think I'm going to call it 5 well-loved magazines. So I think anybody that's bought a lot of magazines over a period of time will know that often if you buy several magazines in a series, or you collect them, if you're collecting them but also reading them, you're not, collecting them not to read, but collecting them as you read them, you do find that certain issues become more well-loved than others. And for me, I can tell the well-loved issues because you can see they start to fall apart. So I'm going to start off with Karang. Now, this first one you see on camera isn't the one I want to talk about, but I just wanted to set this up for this first item. So I started buying Karang magazine when it came out. So that's number 1, June 1981. I just started work. I was 17 and it was 50 pence in the UK. And just I'll flick through the first few copies. So you can see there's number 2, August. So these were coming out monthly at that point. And I actually have kept the first 50 of these that I bought. So I've got the first 50. So the most well-loved one was not 1, it wasn't 2, it wasn't 3, but it was this one. Now it might not look quite as dog-eared, or whatever you want to call it, as the other issues, but I read this the most. Maybe I was super careful, because inside of here, as we flick through, there's a very interesting list, which is the all-time top 100 heavy metal albums. And of course we're in a period before the internet, so lists like this, let me just see if I can get that out of there we go. Lists like this were like gold dust at the time, and I was rather pleased to see that number 1 at that time was Rainbow Rising by Rainbow, which, although this came out considerably later than the release of that album, that was probably my favourite Rainbow album at the time to listen to. And it even goes beyond the top 100, and you have a bubbling under list as well. It was voted by the readers of Karang and Sounds. Karang magazine was a spin-off magazine initially from Sounds magazine. Now the first issue that you saw on camera briefly there, the one with Angus Young on it, contained, I believe, the top 100 singles or top 100 tracks. But I was more interested in the albums than I was the individual tracks. I might flip back to that in a moment just to see what's in there. But yeah, this is my most well-loved copy. Oh, there we go. See, it's starting to separate out here, the Pat Benatar picture. Yeah, this is my most well-loved issue of Karang magazine in terms of just, I know I was in and out of this looking at that list. There's a really interesting article in here on Hendrix as well. I don't know if they've got in here, they also used to do, I don't know if you're familiar with the Rock Family trees at all, but they used to run some of those in here. So I'm just going to go back to the first issue. I think the reason why this is just so rough around the edges, as you can imagine, the first month I had this, yeah, I just kept dipping into it. And the all-time favourite HM tracks as voted here, so it's heavy metal tracks voted by readers of sound. So they did a poll in sounds and it appeared in both sounds and the first issue of Karang. I also kept up to probably the first time I moved, I actually kept a year's worth of sounds magazines from back in the day, but I chucked them out a good few years ago, well before I moved to Nova Scotia. Anyway, there's issue 1, but my most loved is this one because of that all-time top 100 heavy metal albums. I put these roughly in chronological order, so that's my first pick. Second one was, again, I've got the first issue of Terrorizer I bought. It wasn't the first issue that came out. They're already up to number 37. The other thing you'll notice with the magazines I'm going through, there's obviously a bias here on music. Sadly, I don't have any computer magazines. I had a bit of a clear out, and they went a long time ago. So yeah, there's a bias in here towards music. So yeah, number 37, December 1996. So in 96, I was working at my second job in an accounts office on a support line, and I think I had actually read an earlier copy of Terrorizer. This was the first one I bought. It's got the top 30 albums of the year, but my most well-loved issue, even though again just through age and the fact that I probably read this multiple times when it came out, is this one, which came out in February of 2000. And this one, I can see I should put tape down here because it started to separate out quite badly. And this was when they did a 90s issue. So they reviewed the whole of the 90s in extreme music. And again, some great lists. Of course, by then, in 2000s, you know, I'm already on the internet by then, albeit by dial-up. So, you know, I can go to sites and look up lists. But again, this was just, for me, fantastic because just of all the different genres they went through. And great at the time, because we're talking about a period before things like streaming or digital downloads. So this was a good way to work out, you know, for backfilling albums. And in the middle of this somewhere, we have the most important albums of the 90s. And also interesting for me because at that time, so this came out in obviously the end of the 90s into 2000, but all during the 90s I was listening to a lot of indie. So what this issue did for me is it sort of re-educated me in terms of what I had missed in the early 90s prior to me buying that first 96 copy, and that's why I wanted to show you that, because that sort of marks my return to sort of extreme music. Next on the Well Love list, and another music magazine. So this was a special that W.H. Smith released, published by Classic Rock and Metal Hammer, and I'm not sure when this came out. I think it was sometime in the 2000s. Well, it must have been, because this was a set of three. I have all three. So there's a 70s, an 80s and a 90s. And it goes through year by year. But in addition, it has all these, again, interesting sort of genre buyer's guides, which is pretty cool. So there's, if you like, the main thrust of the magazine. So you've got albums of the year 1970, and there's one for each of the years. And if you look here, you can see there's 20 albums. So yeah, this would have come out in the early 2000s. And of course there's also, I'm assuming these are maybe reprints of articles. The NME, I think, also did a series of interesting magazines where they got together articles from various years. I've got 3 of those spanning, I think it's 79 to 81 maybe. I wish I'd collected more of those, but they're not quite as well loved as this one. And I used to frequent a record store which had a lot of 3 for I think £18 CDs from the 70s, and you can see a lot of ticks here are albums that I picked up at the time in there. And so this would form my shopping list for visits to that store, and I could go in and find quite a few albums from that period. But also, of course, at that point, you know, in the 2000s or into the 2000s, as we got into an era where Amazon was taking off, I switched over to buying a lot of stuff off Amazon, because people were offloading their CD collections on Amazon as they moved over to digital. So that was later in the 2000s. But yeah, pretty cool magazine, and I've been through this on countless occasions. I was a bit better at this stage of reading the magazine without overly damaging it. Oh, this one. So I'm interested if anybody watching this has got a little bit more information about this. So I picked this up in the summer of 2010. This is when I first came to Nova Scotia, and I was at Chapters checking out the magazines there, obviously maybe the music magazines, and I just started buying Magic product again. I had just bought some, I think, World Wake maybe, or was about to buy some Rise of the Eldrazi, and I saw this and just had to buy it. And I remember I used to carry this magazine around with me. This was in a period when when I moved from the UK to Canada, previously I'd worked for myself for about 11 years. And when I moved to Canada, that was originally the plan. Didn't really pan out, so I went back to working for a firm. And this was around that time, probably just before then. And I can remember just having this in my messenger bag at the time. It was before I had an iPad or anything like that. It was my understanding is, the reason why I'm curious if anybody knows much more about it, is this was the only issue that I ever saw. And I looked countless times after, and there was supposed to be further issues, but maybe it just didn't sell well. I mean, you know, this sort of magazine, I mean, had already died out to some degree before this was even released. So this is, you know, obviously published by Beckett, who still do magazines on collectible cards, but they just, as far as I know, don't do a Magic the Gathering specific one. So this was, you know, around the time that Rise of the Eldrazi had been released or was about to be released. But it wasn't so much for that I spent a lot of time looking at it. As I went into it deeper into the magazine, it was interesting because of the archetypes. But then I start to get a better understanding of Legacy, because I didn't have such a good understanding of the formats back then. I'm sorry about the shine on that. And then we had this casual corner by Abe Sargent and Laura Mills. And Abe Sargent was a writer who I went on to read a lot of articles online by. Haven't really been following him so much now, but back in the day I read a lot of his EDH articles. So this was all about, we got tribal and emperor formats. Oh, there's a penny sleeve. Oh, there we go, EDH. So this was my first exposure to EDH. Look at that. We've got a banned list. We've got EDH staples. And it's funny, I bet some of these at the time, looking down some of these, are probably pretty reasonable. And I suspect some now that may not have been reprinted quite so much are not. And that was by Benny Smith, and that was another writer that I ended up reading a lot of articles by, and I'm sure I've mentioned him before in Magic the Gathering videos I've done, connected with the idea of EDH toolkits. And he did a series of articles just before Wizards released the first of the Commander products. There's a poster in here. And then the price guide, yeah, which occupies quite a big space on here, but I imagine that just went out of date the moment this magazine was released. But as a historical document, it's quite interesting. Looking up the prices of certain cards as they were when this was released, or at the point they printed this. So how far does it go up to? I don't know if there's any particular order here. They probably put special. Oh, here we go. Yeah, there goes Zendikar Wild White. And then it gets onto all the special sets. Yep, it's just about hanging in there. You can see, yeah, Staples are falling apart. And then the last one, and this one's a little bit better looked after. This was a special magazine. And I think one of the reasons why is I have a digital copy of this as well. And if you're big into effects pedals, this is super cool. It sort of ticks all the boxes. And it goes through, talks about the evolution of effects pedals. 50 greatest effects guitar sounds. So if you're really interested in certain classic tracks about what effect was probably used, although often they get these wrong sometimes. I mean, I'm not saying this magazine get it wrong, but generally when people try and track down effects or postulate on what certain effects they often, it's not unusual for them to not always get it right. Was that story about the cult She Sells Sanctuary was the one where he just effectively used Boss pedals. Yeah, apparently he just switched everything on on his pedal board. And this is super cool. So this is an explanation of all the major categories of effects pedals, including like a sort of buyer's guide of the time if you're you're on a tight budget, mid-price, boutique. Very nice. And I think this magazine is still available digitally. I'm not sure though, because some of these guitar magazines came through like a special app, so not sure. I found this really interesting. Now I've got some other effects books on guitar effects, which obviously double up for some of this, but some of it was pretty interestingly sort of represented. There's a bit on bypass and filtering and building your own pedal board, switching devices, powering up stuff, all the good stuff. Some real life pedal boards, which is really interesting. Although it wasn't that many people in here, that many guitarists. And then this, I love these lists like this. Now this goes through, I don't know whether it says here how they voted on it. So there's a countdown, and I'm not going to flick through all of these, but number one was a Crybaby Classic Wah. I honestly thought, where is it in here? Yeah, I thought the fuzz face might be slightly higher. That got to number 8. And then some Star Sounds, and this was cool as well. Certain famous guitarists and their sounds, or their effects pedals that they're often associated with. And then some crazy pedal stuff, and that's it. And like I said, I've got some other actual full-blown books which serve a similar purpose. I've got some nice ones which go through in terms of the order in which the pedals were released as well. But this is one of my favourites for just having so much useful information in it. It's the Guide to Effects Pedals from Guitarist Magazine. Like I said, it might actually still be available in digital form. Not 100% sure. And there is a similar one to this, I think, published by another major music or guitar magazine, but I just can't remember which one off the top of my head. So thanks once again for watching. If you've got any well-worn magazines that you still have hold of, then yeah, make a note in the comments section. I'll be interested to know if there's anybody out there that have kept hold of They're magazines from way back. It's quite interesting. I've still got a magazine from 81 which hasn't completely disintegrated. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I'll catch you in the next episode.